My name is Colleen Monroe, and while the world knows my sister as the Saint of Asheville, I know her as the woman who sold our mother's soul for a trending hashtag and a $12 million candle empire. I am 31 years old, a technical sergeant in the United States Air Force with 2 commendation medals and a collarbone that still aches every time the humidity hits 80% in North Carolina, a souvenir from a hard landing during a deployment at Al Udeid Air Base. For 6 years, I traded my youth for a flight suit and the grit of service, believing that the distance between me and home was a sacrifice made for the greater good. But while I was coordinating logistics for cargo planes in the desert, Mall Erie was back in our childhood home on Orchard Lane, meticulously erasing every trace of my existence to craft a narrative of being an only child, the sole caregiver to our declining mother, Eleanor. The video playing on the screen right now is grainy, captured by a hidden nest cam I tucked inside a faux ivy plant atop the mahogany bookshelf, and it reveals the rotting core of the Monroe legacy. In the frame, Mall Erie is wearing a bespoke silk slip dress from Legence that probably cost more than my monthly housing allowance. She is leaning over our mother, who sits frail and confused in her wingback chair, the one with the faded floral upholstery that smells faintly of lavender and antiseptic. Mallory's voice, usually a melodic lilt reserved for her 400,000 Instagram followers, is sharp enough to draw blood as she snaps at the woman who gave her life. She tells Mom to read the script, to perform the role of the doting, grateful matriarch for a promotional video for Monroe Radiance candles. When Mom falters, her hands shaking as she fumbles with the heavy cardstock, Mall Erie leans in closer, her manicured nails digging into the soft skin of Mom's forearm. She threatens to increase the vitamins, a chilling euphemism for the heavy sedatives she uses to keep Mom compliant and out of the way of her social calendar. I stood in the shadows of the hallway, still smelling like the stale air of a Delta Connection flight and the North Face backpack slumped at my feet, watching this play out on my phone screen via the local network. 6 years of my life were gone, and in their place, Mall Erie had built a shrine to herself. She renovated the house using the power of attorney she coerced Mom into signing while I was stationed overseas, replacing our family photos with minimalist charcoal sketches and high-end decor. My bedroom, once filled with my track trophies and aviation manuals, had been converted into a temperature-controlled storage room for her midnight jasmine and amber woods inventory. She didn't just take the house, she took my identity. In her published interviews with Southern Living and local Asheville business journals, she spoke of the loneliness of being an only daughter carrying the weight of a sick parent alone. She told the world I didn't exist, and she used Mom's social security checks and the remains of Dad's life insurance to fund her first production line of soy wax candles. The air in the house felt thick, vibrating with the hum of a $5,000 Sub-Zero refrigerator and the silent, suffocating weight of Mallory's lies. I looked down at my hands, calloused from years of mechanical work and heavy lifting, and then at the screen where my sister adjusted her ring light. Every brick of her success was laid with the mortar of betrayal. She had convinced our neighbors that I had eloped and cut ties years ago, creating a fiction where I was the villain and she was the martyr. But the uniform I wore for 6 years taught me one thing above all else: how to observe, how to gather intelligence, and how to strike when the enemy thinks they are most secure. Mall Erie thinks she is filming a marketing campaign for her summer collection, but she is actually filming the evidence of her own downfall. The exact moment I stepped out of the shadows and into the light of that kitchen, the smell of burnt wax and expensive perfume met the cold, hard reality of a sister who had finally come home to collect what was hers. My heart hammered against my ribs, a rhythmic thud that drowned out the chirping of the cicadas outside the window, as I prepared to dismantle the $12 million lie she had spent my entire military career perfecting. Mall Erie had forgotten that I wasn't just a sister she could delete. I was a sergeant trained to survive, and her reign over the Monroe estate was about to reach its terminal velocity. The scent of our home used to be the honest, golden aroma of raw beeswax and the sharp, clean bite of cedar wood, a fragrance my mother, Eleanor, called mountain clay. Back then it was just a small, artisanal operation in our cramped 2-car garage in North Asheville where the concrete floor was permanently stained with wax spills and the humidity made the labels peel off the $24 glass jars. I remember the weight of the heavy stirring paddles in my hands and the way my fingernails were always rimmed with soot, while Mall Erie would drift through the kitchen in her pristine white tennis skirts, claiming her allergies were too severe for manual labor. The contrast between that memory and the sterile high-end nightmare she has created is enough to make my stomach turn. while I was hunkered down in sun-bleached desert tents halfway across the globe, surviving on $2.15 MREs that tasted like cardboard and chemicals. I was meticulously calculating every penny of my $3,800 monthly sergeant's pay to wire home. I lived on less than $100 a month for personal expenses, wearing the same frayed flight suit and sleeping on a cot that smelled of dust and jet fuel. Also, my mother could afford the specialized physical therapy and the $400 monthly prescriptions for her neurological decline. I thought I was the anchor keeping our family afloat, but I was actually just the silent benefactor of my sister's calculated theft. Mall Erie took our mother's humble legacy and rebranded it into Lunara Botanics, a cold, corporate entity that stripped away the soul of the craft to make room for a $12 million valuation. She moved into a 5,000-square-foot mansion in the cliffs at Walnut Cove, a glass and stone monstrosity that feels more like an art gallery than a home, while our mother was relegated to a guest wing that Mall Erie treats like a bothersome storage unit. As I stood in the doorway of her foyer, my heavy combat boots feeling out of place on the polished Italian marble, I watched her glide across the floor in $900 Manolo Blahnik BB pumps, the suede a deep emerald green that matched the accent wall of her living room. She was the picture of the devoted, exhausted daughter for her latest press release, leaning over a mahogany desk to sign documents while complaining to a publicist about the weight of being the sole caregiver. The injustice of it felt like a physical blow to my chest, a pressure sharper than the shrapnel scar on my shoulder. Every luxury she touched, from the $4,000 restoration hardware sofa to the Audi Q8 idling in the driveway, was bought with the money I sent home and the business she stole from a woman who no longer remembers how to scent a candle. My sister's hands are soft, pampered by weekly $60 manicures and expensive creams, never having known the sting of a wax burn or the grit of a deployment, yet she stands there telling the world she built this empire from the ground up while nursing our mother through her darkest days. She spoke to the cameras about the long nights of sacrifice, her voice trembling with a practiced cinematic grief, while I remembered the nights I spent staring at the desert stars, praying that the wire transfers went through so Mom wouldn't lose her house. Mall Erie didn't just rebrand a business, she rebranded our history, casting herself as the hero of a story she never actually lived. She looks at Mom and sees a prop for her brand identity, a way to sell $38 candles with names like Matriarch's Grace, while I look at Mom and see the woman who taught me that family is a bond of blood and sweat, not a marketing strategy. The silk of Mallory's dress hissed as she turned to face me, her eyes widening as she realized that the sister she had declared dead to the world was standing in her entryway, a living testament to every lie she had ever told to get ahead. This mansion was built on the back of my service and my mother's illness, and as I gripped the strap of my tactical bag, I knew that the foundation of Lunara Botanics was about to crumble under the weight of the truth I brought back from the sand. It was exactly 6:14 on Christmas Eve when the tires of my battered black 2018 Jeep Cherokee crunched over the frozen gravel of the driveway at 142 Sycamore Ridge, the air so cold it felt like inhaling powdered glass. I stepped out into the biting North Carolina wind, my breath hitching in my chest as I adjusted the heavy strap of my faded olive-drab military duffel bag, a bag that had traveled with me from the humid heat of Al Udeid to the gravelly winds of Buckram and now back to the porch of my childhood home. I expected the warmth of a hearth and the frantic, tearful embrace of a sister who had missed me, but when the heavy solid oak door swung open, the only thing that met me was a wall of clinical, expensive fragrance and a gaze as sharp as a bayonet. Mall Erie stood there framed by the golden light of the foyer, smelling of Le Labo Santal 33. A boutique perfume that costs $330 a bottle, her silhouette draped in a cream-colored cashmere wrap that likely retailed for more than my monthly hazardous duty pay. Her eyes didn't soften when they landed on my face. Instead, they flickered down to my scuffed combat boots and the worn fabric of my bag with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt, as if I were a stray dog begging for scraps at a gala. "You do not belong here, Colleen," she sneered, her voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss that barely carried over the festive strains of a string quartet playing inside. She leaned against the doorframe, blocking my entry with the calculated grace of a woman who owned the world, telling me that Mom had developed dementia and that in her confusion, she had completely forgotten the daughter who supposedly abandoned her for a life of camouflage and dust. The lie was so effortless, so polished, that for a split second I felt the familiar ache of the shrapnel scar in my shoulder throb with the sheer injustice of it. I tried to speak to tell her about the $3,800 I sent home every single month from my sergeant's salary to cover the very medical care she was now using as a weapon against me, but she didn't give me the chance. With a flick of her manicured wrist, she slammed the 3-inch thick oak door in my face, and I heard the heavy thud of the deadbolt sliding into place, a sound that echoed through the silent, snow-dusted valley like a gunshot. Standing there in the freezing darkness of the porch, the temperature dropping toward 22 degrees Fahrenheit, I walked toward the large bay window to the left of the entrance, my fingers trembling from the cold and the adrenaline surging through my veins. Through the expensive double-pane glass, I saw a scene of curated perfection that looked like a spread from Architectural Digest, dominated by a $4,000 tiered crystal chandelier that cast a shimmering, artificial glow over a room filled with wealthy investors in tailored suits and silk cocktail dresses. They were laughing, sipping vintage Veuve Clicquot from crystal flutes and admiring the Lunara Botanics branding displayed on every surface, while our mother, Eleanor, was tucked away in a shadowed corner of the room. She sat in her old wingback chair, but she looked like a ghost of the woman who used to teach me how to pour hot wax without forming bubbles. Her eyes were glassy and vacant, staring at nothing as she swayed slightly, clearly drugged into a state of pliable silence by the heavy sedatives Moll Erie had used to keep her from ruining the evening's aesthetic. My mother was a prop in her own house, a silent testament to a daughter's devotion that was nothing more than a profitable fiction, and as I watched Moll Erie glide toward an investor with a practiced, tragic smile, I realized that my sister hadn't just locked me out of the house. She had imprisoned our mother in a gilded cage built with my own stolen sacrifices. I spent the long hollow hours of that Christmas Eve in a 24-hour Waffle House off Tunnel Road, sitting in a cracked oxblood vinyl booth that smelled of industrial degreaser and burnt coffee grounds. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a persistent, dizzying frequency that mirrored the vibration in my own skull as I stared out at the freezing rain turning into sleet against the window pane. I laid out a single thin paper napkin on the laminate tabletop and using a black Pilot G2 pen I pulled from the pocket of my tactical jacket, I drew a jagged vertical line down the center of the white square. On the left side, I scrawled the figures of Mallory's empire. A $12 million company valuation, a 5,000 square foot fortress on Sycamore Ridge, and the 400,000 followers who believed her every manufactured word. On the right side, I placed the evidence of her crimes. My mother's signature on a revised 2023 will that I had glimpsed on the mahogany desk through the window. A signature that was no longer the elegant, flowing script of a woman who loved calligraphy but a shaky, desperate scrawl that looked like a jagged cry for help. The realization hit me with the force of a low-altitude pressure change that Moll Erie wasn't just a greedy sibling who had grown accustomed to luxury. She was a predator who had systematically dismantled our mother's autonomy while I was half a world away. Love and family loyalty were no longer the tools for this mission because you cannot negotiate with someone who sees a human being as a branding asset. I looked at my reflection in the dark window, seeing the exhaustion of a 31-year-old sergeant who had survived the harshest environments on Earth only to be outmaneuvered in her own living room. I didn't need a sisterly heart-to-heart or a mediator. I needed tactical precision and a legal scorched earth policy that would leave Lunara Botanics in ashes. The coffee in my white ceramic mug was cold and bitter, priced at $2.25 with tax. A stark contrast to the vintage champagne Moll Erie was currently serving to her investors. I reached into the pocket of my jeans and pulled out my cracked iPhone 13, the screen glowing with the harsh white light of the contacts list. I scrolled past the names of my commanding officers and my fellow airmen until I found the one person I knew who hated bullies more than I did, a man who had spent 30 years as a JAG officer before opening a private practice in downtown Asheville. I dialed the number for Marcus Thorne, a man who didn't care about social media influence or $12 million candles, but who cared deeply about the integrity of a signature and the protection of the vulnerable. As the line began to ring, I watched a lone police cruiser roll slowly through the parking lot, its blue and red lights reflecting off the ice-covered asphalt. I knew that by the time the sun rose over the Blue Ridge Mountains, the war for my mother's life and my own legacy would no longer be a silent struggle in the shadows of a mansion. Moll Erie had spent 6 years building a house of cards, and she had forgotten that I was trained to find the one structural weakness that would bring the entire thing crashing down to the foundation. When Marcus picked up the phone with a gravelly voice, I didn't say hello or Merry Christmas. I simply told him that it was time to initiate a recovery operation for a high-value asset, and that we were going to start with a forensic audit of every cent that had flowed through my mother's account since the day I deployed. The following morning at exactly 7:45, the sky over Asheville was a bruised purple and the temperature hovered at a biting 28 degrees as I stepped into the office of Camila Wren, a woman who had transitioned from a high-stakes JAG officer to the most feared estate litigator in the county. Her workspace on the fourth floor of a refurbished brick building on Patton Avenue didn't look like a traditional law office. It was a tactical war room that smelled of high-end toner, old parchment, and the acidic punch of the black espresso she drank from a battered steel tumbler like it was high-octane fuel. Camila was 52 years old, possessed a gaze that could pierce through a reinforced bunker, and she didn't waste a single second on pleasantries as she cleared a space on her walnut desk for the stacks of documents I had managed to secure. We spent the next 14 grueling hours submerged in a sea of county records, digital bank statements and property deeds, the only sound in the room being the rhythmic hum of her heavy-duty Brother laser printer and the scratching of our pens against legal pads. By 9 p.m. the surrounding office buildings had gone dark, but Camila's room was illuminated by the harsh glow of dual monitors displaying the stark evolution of the Monroe family legacy. We laid out the original 2018 will, a document drafted just weeks before my first deployment, which clearly listed me as a 50% beneficiary of the house, the artisanal beeswax business, and the $600,000 life insurance policy my father had left behind. Beside it, we placed the 2023 amendment, a cold and clinical piece of paper that wiped my name from the records entirely and granted Mall Erie total control over Lunara Botanics and the Sycamore Ridge estate. Camila leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she picked up a silver-trimmed Mont Blanc Meisterstock pen that cost $550, using the tip to trace the shaky, erratic lines of our mother's signature at the bottom of the page. "This isn't just the natural decline of age or the tremors of a neurological condition, Colleen," she said, her voice dropping into a register of controlled fury that I had only ever heard from commanding officers before a strike. She pointed out the microscopic hesitations in the ink and the way the pen had dragged across the heavy bond paper, noting that the signature lacked the muscle memory of a conscious person. Camila looked me dead in the eye and stated with absolute clinical certainty that this was the result of chemical coercion, a signature obtained while our mother was under the influence of the very sedatives I had seen Mall Erie threatening her with on the hidden camera footage. We were looking at a $12 million fraud built on the back of elder abuse and the systematic erasure of a service member's rights, a realization that made the coffee in my stomach feel like molten lead. My sister hadn't just been managing the family affairs. She had been conducting a long-range psychological operation to strip me of my inheritance and our mother of her dignity. Every hour we spent in that room, digging through the $400 an hour forensic accounting of my mother's dwindling personal savings, reinforced the truth that Mall Erie had used my military salary to fund the legal fees required to disinherit me. The fluorescent lights of the office flickered, casting long shadows against the walls covered in legal certifications, as Camila began drafting the initial injunction that would freeze every one of Mallory's corporate accounts. We were no longer just looking for a fair share of a candle company. We were preparing to dismantle a criminal enterprise that had mistaken my absence for weakness. As I watched Camila's pen fly across the page, I knew that the precision of the law was about to collide with the arrogance of Mallory's empire in a way that no amount of expensive perfume or social media influence could ever mask. On New Year's Day at exactly 7 p.m., the Asheville Grand Ballroom was a sprawling sea of opulence, vibrating with the low hum of 150 members of the city's elite who had paid upwards of $500 a plate to witness the Lunara Legacy Gala. The air was thick with the scent of 500 hand-poured midnight jasmine candles and the expensive aroma of a $45,000 catering spread featuring Wagyu beef sliders and truffle-infused appetizers. Mall Erie stood center stage under the blinding heat of the spotlights, a vision of calculated perfection in a $5,000 emerald silk gown by Oscar de la Renta that shimmered like a serpent's scales with every breath she took. She held our mother's hand with a grip that looked tender to the cameras but which I knew was the firm hold of a puppeteer, using the frail 72-year-old woman as a living prop to validate her $12 million brand. "My mother's vision is my command," Mall Erie proclaimed into the gold-plated microphone, her voice dripping with a rehearsed, honeyed sincerity that caused a collective sigh of admiration from the potential private equity buyers seated in the front row. I entered through the heavy mahogany service doors at the back of the hall, the rhythmic click of my polished black Oxfords on the marble floor cutting through the soft orchestral music like a metronome. I wasn't wearing the casual denim or the faded tactical jacket of a forgotten sister. I was dressed in my Air Force classy uniform, every crease of the dark blue fabric sharpened to a razor edge and my silver sergeant stripes gleaming under the chandeliers. The rows of service ribbons on my chest, including the Commendation Medal and the Small Arms Expert Marksmanship ribbon, felt heavy and grounded against the backdrop of so much superficial glitter. In my right hand I carried a standard government-issue manila folder that felt weightier than any weapon I had ever handled in the desert, containing the forensic audit, the hidden camera transcripts, and the original 2018 will that Mal Erie thought she had buried forever. The room began to go quiet as I marched down the center aisle, the guests turning in their velvet cushioned chairs to stare at the decorated soldier who was effectively crashing the most prestigious event of the winter season. I saw Mallory's face pale beneath her expensive airbrushed makeup, her eyes widening as she recognized the sister she had told everyone was estranged and unstable. The transition from her practiced saintly smile to a mask of sheer, naked terror was instantaneous as I reached the foot of the stage, the light reflecting off the brass buttons of my tunic. I didn't scream or cause a scene. I simply maintained the terrifyingly official posture of a woman who had spent 6 years mastering discipline and protocol. Every step I took toward the stage was a reclamation of the 6 years of my life she had tried to erase and a final stand for the woman sitting in that chair who didn't even realize her own daughter was a predator. Mal Erie tried to signal the security guards, men in $300 suits standing by the exits, but the sheer authority of the uniform and the cold, tactical precision of my gaze held them in place. I ascended the 3 steps to the platform, the smell of her Le Labo perfume clashing with the metallic clean scent of my starch and brass. I didn't look at the crowd or the cameras. I looked directly into the eyes of the woman who had sold our mother for a profit margin. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning system and the ragged breath of our mother, who blinked up at me with a sudden flickering spark of recognition in her tired eyes. I opened the folder, the crisp white pages of Camilla Wren's legal injunction catching the light, and I prepared to deliver the one thing Mallory's $12 million could never buy: the truth. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was a military-grade dismantling of a fraudulent empire, and as I stood there in the center of her curated world, I knew that by the time the clock struck 8, the Lunara legacy would be nothing more than a case study in corporate and moral bankruptcy. I did not raise my voice or offer the satisfaction of a scene because I had been trained in the art of the clinical strike, so I simply waited for the moderator to open the floor for the Q&A session. When the gold-plated microphone stand became available, I stepped forward with the measured pace of a soldier on parade, my polished black low quarters clicking rhythmically against the Italian marble floor of the Asheville Grand Ballroom. Mal Erie, I have a specific question regarding the section labeled Legacy on page 14 of your investor deck. Specifically the part where you claim a foundation of transparency and maternal care, I said, my voice projecting with a steady, military-grade calm through the $10,000 Bose professional sound system. I reached into the pocket of my service dress tunic and pulled out a compact high-lumen portable projector that I had pre-synced to the venue's wireless network during the 20 minutes I spent observing from the shadows of the catering entrance. Before Mal Erie could signal the tech crew to cut the power, I bypassed the ballroom's firewall and projected a massive 40-foot-wide image onto the pristine white silk screen directly behind her head, effectively drowning out the Lunara Botanics branding. The grainy hidden camera footage flickered to life, showing the world exactly what happened in the guest wing of the Sycamore Ridge estate at 3:45 in the morning while the city slept. The high-fidelity speakers captured the sharp metallic snap of Mallory's voice as she berated our mother, the woman who had built the very business Mal Erie was now trying to sell for $12 million. The guests watched in a paralyzed, suffocating silence as Mal Erie shoved a script into our mother's trembling hands and threatened to increase her dosage of sedatives if she didn't perform for the cameras. I didn't stop there because a tactical victory requires the total neutralization of the threat, so I toggled the display to a series of high-resolution PDF bank statements from Wells Fargo and Bank of America. The red-bordered highlights showed a systematic siphoning of $212,000 from our mother's personal retirement savings, funds meant for her end-of-life care, transferred directly into Mallory's shell company accounts to pay for her $900 shoes and $45,000 catering bills. The collective gasp from the 150 elite guests was a physical wave of sound that died out as quickly as it started, leaving a void so profound you could hear the hum of the $3,000 an hour lighting rig. In the third row, a prominent billionaire investor from a private equity firm in Charlotte stared in slack-jawed horror as his hand began to shake, causing his crystal glass of 18-year-old Macallan Scotch to slip from his fingers. The heavy lead crystal shattered against the marble with a violent, final crack that echoed through the vaulted ceiling like a judge's gavel, the amber liquid staining the white floor just as the truth was staining Mallory's carefully curated reputation. She stood frozen in the center of the stage, her $5,000 emerald gown suddenly looking like a cheap costume, while the glowing evidence of her elder abuse and financial fraud loomed over her like a digital executioner. I watched the blood drain from her face, leaving her pale and hollow under the unforgiving heat of the spotlights as the potential buyers for her empire quietly stood up and began to walk toward the exits without uttering a single word. My mother, momentarily jolted from her chemical fog by the sudden shift in the room's energy, looked up at the screen and then at me, a flicker of heartbreaking clarity crossing her face as she realized her soldier daughter had finally returned to finish the war. Mal Erie had spent 6 years trying to bury me in the sand of a distant desert, but in the span of 3 minutes, I had used the very technology she used to build her lies to dismantle her entire existence in front of the people she valued most. This wasn't just a business failure. It was the total collapse of a predator's habitat, and as the sirens of the Asheville Police Department began to wail in the distance, I knew the legacy of the Monroe family was finally being returned to the hands of those who actually worked for it. The fallout from the gala was less of a social scandal and more of a tactical nuclear strike on the foundation of Mallory's existence, as within 48 hours, every major venture capital firm and private equity investor from Charlotte to Manhattan had formally withdrawn their support, an exodus that triggered a $3 million immediate debt recall from her primary lenders at Bank of America. The high-gloss facade of Lunara Botanics, which had been valued at $12 million just 72 hours prior, evaporated into a cloud of litigation and toxic assets as the Asheville Police Department's Special Victims Unit opened a comprehensive elder abuse investigation based on the mountain of medical records and pharmaceutical logs that Camila Wren and I had legally seized via an emergency court order. Trevor Dace, the silver-tongued snake of a lawyer who had spent years drafting the fraudulent amendments to my mother's will for a $20,000 monthly retainer, performed a disappearing act that would have impressed a magician, clearing out his corner office on Biltmore Avenue before the first subpoena could even be processed by the sheriff's department. While the local news outlets scrambled to cover the implosion of Asheville's golden daughter, I was busy executing the final phase of my recovery operation, which involved moving my mother, Eleanor, out of that sterile mausoleum on Sycamore Ridge and into a sun-drenched 2-bedroom bungalow I secured in the quiet tree-lined neighborhood of Montford. The house cost $480,000. A modest sum compared to Mallory's glass fortress, but it featured a wraparound porch and a thriving perennial garden where the soil actually smelled like the earth instead of expensive synthetic candles. The most profound change, however, wasn't the scenery but the woman herself, as we transitioned her off the heavy 400mg suppressants and sedatives Mal Erie had been forcing down her throat to keep her compliant for the cameras. Within a week of being in a clean, chemical-free environment, my mother's eyes began to lose that terrifying milky glaze, regaining a sharp amber brightness that I hadn't seen since before my third deployment to the Middle East. We spent our afternoons sitting on the back deck, the air filled with the natural scent of damp pine needles and the distant rhythmic drumming of a woodpecker, as she slowly began to reclaim the fragments of her own identity. She still has her difficult days where the fog of her condition rolls back in, but now those moments are met with genuine care and the specialized medical attention of a private nurse I hired for $85 an hour using the funds we recovered from Mallory's frozen corporate accounts. Watching her hands, once frozen in a drug-induced tremor, begin to steady as she reaches for a cup of Earl Grey tea is a victory more significant than any promotion I earned in the Air Force. Mallory's world is currently reduced to a series of depositions and the crushing weight of a $3 million liability that she cannot possibly cover, her $900 Manolo Blahniks now pacing the linoleum floors of a public defender's office. I don't feel a shred of guilt for the wreckage I left behind because I know that family isn't defined by the blood in your veins or the name on a luxury brand. It is defined by the people who stay to protect you when the world goes dark. As I look at my mother who is currently humming an old folk song while she prunes a rosebush in the garden, I realize that I didn't just win a legal battle or settle a score. I successfully completed the most important mission of my career, bringing a high-value asset back from the brink of total erasure. The $12 million empire is gone, but the $24 jars of mountain clay beeswax candles are sitting on our new kitchen counter. A small, fragrant reminder that the truth, much like a well-made wick, can stay lit even in the most suffocating of storms. The digital silence of my home was briefly interrupted at exactly 2:45 in the morning by the sterile blue glow of my smartphone on the nightstand, signaling a desperate 3-page email from Mall Erie that read like a frantic psychological profile of a collapsing ego. She was no longer the poised CEO of a $12 million empire but a woman drowning in the reality of a $3 million debt recall, begging me for a short-term loan of $50,000 just to stall the foreclosure proceedings on the 5,000-square-foot glass fortress on Sycamore Ridge. I didn't even bother to read past the first paragraph of her calculated apologies and hollow promises to change. Instead, I performed a clinical final deletion of the message and permanently blocked her address from my server with 2 taps of my thumb. The consequences of her predatory behavior had finally caught up to the high-speed life she had built on the back of our mother's illness. And as I watched the screen go dark, I felt the kind of absolute quiet closure that only comes after a successful mission extraction. The reports from the local community in Asheville painted a stark picture of her descent as she was forced to sell her custom-ordered 2024 Lexus RX 350 for pennies on the dollar to a predatory wholesale lot just to cover the initial $10,000 retainer for a second-tier public defender. Gone were the $900 Manolo Blahnik pumps and the $5,000 designer gowns, replaced by the drab polyester uniform of a low-level service worker in a dying shopping mall. My sister, who once looked down on our mother's $24 artisanal beeswax candles as beneath her, is currently spending 40 hours a week standing on the cold linoleum floor of a Central Concourse kiosk, peddling mass-produced paraffin candles for a mere $10 an hour. She spends her days trying to convince uninterested passers-by to buy 3 for $15 scented tins while her former social circle cruises past her without a second glance, her presence erased as thoroughly as she once tried to erase mine. While Mall Erie deals with the crushing weight of the $3 million civil judgment and the looming threat of criminal charges for elder abuse, my life has returned to a rhythm dictated by genuine care and the slow, steady recovery of the woman who actually built the Monroe name. I spent the morning in our new backyard, the air crisp with the scent of damp pine and the $38 bag of premium organic soil I bought to help Mom replant her favorite hydrangeas. My mother's recovery is not a linear path, but seeing her sit on the porch of our bungalow with a clear mind and a steady hand as she sips a $4 artisanal tea is a wealth that no investor deck could ever quantify. I am no longer a sergeant stationed half a world away, sending my $3,800 monthly pay into a black hole of betrayal. I am a daughter who stood her ground when the family legacy was under siege and won. The Sycamore Ridge mansion eventually went to auction, sold for a fraction of its value to a developer who planned to gut the sterile, minimalist interior that Mall Erie had used to hide our history. Every time I drive past the mall on my way to the VA hospital for my shoulder physical therapy, I think about the irony of my sister's new station in life, hawking cheap wax in the shadows of the empire she tried to steal. Family isn't a commodity to be traded for market share, and it isn't a prop to be used for social media engagement. It is the person who keeps watch in the middle of the night and the one who ensures that the truth is never silenced by a price tag. I looked over at my mother, who was currently laughing at a neighborhood cat stalking a butterfly, and I realized that while Mall Erie was counting her remaining $10 bills, I was finally holding the only inheritance that ever truly mattered. The war for the Monroe legacy is over, the tactical objectives have all been met, and for the first time in 6 years, the air around us smells like nothing but peace and honest, unadulterated beeswax. The transition from the sterile corporate vacuum of Lunara Botanics back to the tactile reality of our original studio felt like a homecoming for my very soul, a reclamation of the 1,200-square-foot garage space where the floorboards are still stained with the history of our labor. We officially reverted the business name to Monroe & Daughter, stripping away the pretension of the $12 million empire to return to the honest, artisanal roots that Mall Erie had tried so desperately to bury under layers of marketing jargon and synthetic fragrances. It is not a global empire stretching across high-end department stores, and that is precisely the point of this new chapter. We have intentionally capped our production to maintain the integrity of the craft, focusing on the $18 small batch jars that people actually use to bring warmth into their homes. Our monthly sales now hover around a consistent $15,000, a figure that covers our overhead, the $400 weekly specialty grocery bills, and the comfortable life we've built in the Montford bungalow without the crushing weight of a $3 million debt recall hanging over our heads. Every morning at exactly 9 a.m., the studio fills with the authentic, sharp scent of real cedarwood shavings and the calming floral undertones of dried lavender buds, a sensory profile that is a world away from the chemical-heavy perfumes Mall Erie used to favor. My mother sits in her favorite ergonomic chair by the oversized bay window, the morning sun catching the silver in her hair as she meticulously measures out the essential oils with a steady, practiced hand that no longer requires the numbing fog of sedatives. She isn't a prop for an investor deck anymore. She is the master crafter, finally breathing air that isn't thick with the heavy, cloying lies of a daughter who saw her as a liability. I spend my time managing the logistics, applying the same tactical discipline I learned during my 6 years as an Air Force sergeant to ensure our supply chain for organic beeswax remains untainted and our shipping deadlines are met with military precision. The clinking of the glass jars and the low hum of the wax melter provide a rhythmic soundtrack to a life that is defined by peace rather than prestige, proving that a $15,000 a month reality is infinitely more valuable than a $12 million fiction. We don't spend $45,000 on gala catering or $900 on Italian suede pumps, choosing instead to invest our earnings into my mother's long-term health fund and the quiet comforts of a home filled with genuine laughter and the soft glow of our own candles. While Mall Erie is likely still standing on that mall linoleum, counting out $10 bills and wondering where it all went wrong, I am watching my mother smile as she catches the scent of a perfectly balanced mountain clay batch. The scars on my shoulder from my deployment and the bitterness of the betrayal on Sycamore Ridge haven't vanished, but they have faded into the background, softened by the daily realization that I successfully defended the most important perimeter of all. Family isn't the blood that betrays you for a profit margin. It is the person who sits beside you in the quiet moments, mixing scents and sharing stories, finally free from the shadows of a gilded cage. As the sun sets over the Blue Ridge Mountains, casting a long golden light across our workstation, I know that the Monroe legacy isn't measured in market share or social media followers, but in the simple, honest clarity of a life lived without the burden of a single lie. The final victory in this long, exhausting campaign for my mother's life and our family's dignity was never actually about the $12 million valuation of a hollow company or the redistribution of stolen assets, but rather it was found in the profound and absolute silence that now fills our home. There is a specific kind of peace that only exists in the total absence of manufactured drama, a quiet that isn't empty but is instead heavy with the weight of security and the knowledge that the perimeter of our lives is finally secure against the predators who share our DNA. My Air Force Class A uniform with its crisp dark blue fabric and the silver sergeant stripes that I wore like armor during that New Year's Day gala, now hangs in the back of my cedar-lined closet next to a collection of worn flannel shirts and tactical jackets. It serves as a silent, iron-pressed reminder that while I possess the training, the discipline, and the cold-blooded tactical precision required to dismantle an empire, I have reached a point where I infinitely prefer the quiet construction of the life I have built here in Montford. The heavy oak door of our bungalow stays locked not out of a sense of fear or paranoia, but as a deliberate boundary against the toxic influence of a sister who viewed our mother as a depreciating asset and me as a ghost to be exorcised for a better brand story. I no longer wake up at 2:45 in the morning to the frantic vibration of emails begging for $50,000 loans or desperate, gaslighting apologies written in the dark, because I have learned that some bridges aren't just meant to be burned, they are meant to be demolished to the very bedrock. Standing in the studio at 6 p.m. as the sun dips below the silhouette of the Blue Ridge Mountains, I watch the golden light catch the steam rising from a fresh batch of $18 mountain clay candles, the air smelling of raw beeswax and the sharp, honest bite of cedarwood oil. My mother, Eleanor, sits in the armchair nearby, her hands no longer trembling from the chemical cocktail of 400 milligram sedatives, her eyes focused on a book of botanical illustrations rather than a teleprompter or a marketing script. The $15,000 we generate in monthly sales provides us with a quality of life that Mallory's $12 million could never achieve because our books are balanced with integrity and our sleep is unburdened by the weight of a single lie. I have traded the high-altitude pressure of cargo bays and the grit of desert deployments for the steady, grounding rhythm of a small-scale artisanal workshop, finding that the greatest service I can perform is the protection of this one fragile sanctuary. Every now and then, I catch a glimpse of the jagged scar on my collarbone in the mirror, a physical map of a past life defined by conflict, but it no longer throbs with the phantom pain of betrayal or the urgency of a war that wasn't mine to fight. Mall Erie is a fading shadow in the rearview mirror of our history, a footnote in a story about resilience and the reclamation of a name that she tried to sell to the highest bidder. There is an immense, unquantifiable power in the feeling of a locked door that stays locked, a barrier that keeps the world's noise at bay and allows us to exist in a space where the only thing that matters is the next pour of wax and the next quiet breath of a mother who finally knows she is safe. Family isn't a debt to be paid or a legacy to be exploited. It is the person who stands in the breach when the walls start to crumble, and as I blow out the last candle in the studio, I realize that the silence I've earned is the most expensive thing I've ever owned. Family is not blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and in the end, the only thing left standing in the wreckage of the Monroe Empire is the bond that no amount of money could ever buy or break. I sit at the reclaimed heart pine desk in our new studio, my fingers tracing the raised seal of the 2018 last will and testament that has finally been reinstated by a definitive court order from the Buncombe County Superior Court. The document feels heavy, a physical manifestation of a 6-year war fought across continents and courtrooms, its original ink representing a time before my mother's mind was clouded by age and her youngest daughter's calculated cruelty. I am now the legally designated guardian of Eleanor Monroe's legacy and her physical well-being, a responsibility that carries more weight than any rank or commendation I earned during my service in the United States Air Force. Mall Erie has become nothing more than a flickering ghost in our rearview mirror, a cautionary tale of greed that I have effectively exorcised from our daily existence to ensure that the air my mother breathes remains untainted by the sulfur of betrayal. The $12 million empire of Lunara Botanics has been liquidated to pay off the $3 million debt recall, leaving behind only the original recipes for mountain clay and the honest, $24 jars of beeswax that started it all in a cramped garage. The tactical reality of my life now is defined by the absence of the constant high-alert tension that comes from sharing blood with a predator, as I have learned that the ultimate form of self-preservation is the total and permanent severance of toxic ties. My uniform stays in the closet, its brass buttons polished but its service complete, because I have found a different kind of mission in the quiet corners of this bungalow where the only deadline is the cooling time of a fresh batch of lavender-scented wax. I watch my mother through the glass of the studio door. She is wearing a thick wool cardigan and holding a ceramic mug of tea that cost $4 from a local tea merchant, her gaze fixed on the sunset with a clarity that was once stolen from her for a marketing campaign. There is no longer a need for hidden cameras or forensic audits because the perimeter of our lives is guarded by the truth and a legal injunction that keeps my sister at a distance of no less than 500 yards at all times. Mallory's emails have stopped, her phone number is a dead line in a digital graveyard, and the news of her selling $10 candles at a mall kiosk has become a distant static that no longer disturbs the frequency of my peace. I realized that saving myself and my mother required a level of ruthlessness I usually reserved for overseas deployments, a clinical detachment that allowed me to prioritize the victim over the perpetrator despite the shared history of our childhood. The 50% beneficiary clause in the 2018 will isn't just a financial win. It is a restoration of the natural order, a declaration that the daughter who sacrificed her $3,800 monthly pay to keep the lights on is the one who truly earned the right to carry the torch forward. We live on $15,000 a month now, a sum that feels like a fortune because it isn't stained with the shame of elder abuse or the hollow vanity of a social media following built on lies. The final victory is found in the simple act of locking the front door at night and knowing exactly who is on the other side of it, a security that no amount of $900 shoes or $45,000 catering bills could ever provide. I have reclaimed the Monroe name from the wreckage of a criminal enterprise and returned it to the woman who taught me that family is a bond of sweat and sincerity rather than a branding strategy for wealthy investors. As the last of the daylight fades over the Blue Ridge Mountains, leaving the studio in a warm amber glow, I understand that the most difficult part of the journey wasn't the combat or the litigation, but the moment I decided that my own survival was worth the cost of losing a sister. I am the guardian of a legacy that smells of honest beeswax and cedarwood, And for the first time in my 31 years, the silence of my home is a melody of pure, unadulterated freedom. My mother is safe, the business is honest, and the ghost of the golden daughter has finally been laid to rest in the shadows of the past where she can no longer reach us.